Michael, we discussed your book last year, and I'm just kind of wondering how an actual war affects waging peace in a time of war. And as part of that, I wanted to ask you about the central premise was that the U.S. should exercise what you call resolute restraint, meaning being resolute in sticking up for certain principles of the post-war era that have, been stabilized peace generally. They've tended to stabilize the peace, and also being restrained in not going too far. So how does the war in Ukraine fit into that concept of resolute restraint?
Hi, Bob. It's great to be with you. Well, a couple of things about this war and, the context of my book. If I was gonna rewrite the book or issue a new version this year, I would insert the word great power next to the word peace. So it's the art of war in the age of great power peace. It still is the age of great power peace. And one of the most telling decisions President Biden made, of course, maybe the single most important in this whole thing, was not to risk the direct participation of US combat forces in a war against Russia, another nuclear armed state. And so the combination of the memories of the world wars, nuclear weapons deterrence, and other considerations have, it seems, at least for the time being, persuaded world leaders that the great powers just cannot afford to fight each other, even when there are such horrible things happening that we'd like to stop in some way. And at some tactical level, at least, probably could stop with use of NATO air power against Russian artillery and tanks. That would beg the question of what Russia would do next. And that's the whole point. We don't know, we couldn't control it. And so rather than find out, we decide to throw the kitchen sink at them and everything else except our own military. And so in that sense, it is still an age of peace, but limited to peace between the great powers, and among that, top 10 or 12 group in the world, most of them nuclear, or either nuclear weapon states or huge industrial powers. But in terms of resolute restraint, yes, I think that what President Biden is underscoring is that we would fight for the defense of our allies, NATO members, and of course in East Asia, Japan, et cetera. It seems that he would also fight in defense of Taiwan. That's something he's talked about in the last year, even though we don't have an official US policy on that, but he's not willing to fight beyond that. He's pulled out of Afghanistan. I think that was a mistake, given that we could have accomplished at least some limited goals with very limited resources, but we can debate that. He still is sticking true to the concept that we need to be restrained in some ways, but resolute in defense of this country, its own territory, its own people, and its treaty allies. And so in that sense, I think in a way, Biden's worldview is not too different from mine. He's made some specific decisions that I would challenge or perhaps have a different take on. Most importantly, getting out of Afghanistan abruptly, and also continuing the promise that we would bring Ukraine into NATO someday. So Biden showed restraint in not wanting to fight in this war, but he failed to show restraint in his expansive interest in enlarging NATO, which is already about to be twice the size it was at the end of the Cold War. It's about to have 32 members, with Finland and Sweden expected to join soon. That's twice the 16 that we had when the actual anti-Soviet coalition was necessary. And I think that I'm not trying to excuse what Putin's done here, but part of the backdrop to the Russian decision to attack Ukraine was the expectation that the West was going to try to pull Ukraine into its orbit. And Ukraine, of course, has been at the center of East-West power competition for a millennium, and Putin had no intention of sort of losing it to the West on his watch. So in that sense, I think Biden failed to show adequate restraint. He's very typical of most Democrats and Republicans in the United States on that issue, at least in the foreign policy community. Most of my colleagues in the US strategic community were in favor of NATO expansion, even as far east as Ukraine and Georgia. I was not. A few other people like Bill Burns and former Secretary of Defense Bill Perry were not, but we lost the debate. And in that sense, Biden did not show restraint. So, we can apply the concept in other cases and try to flesh out how you should be resolute on the really core fundamental interests. but be restrained on the second and third order interests, it always is going to require some interpretation. There's no cookbook or edict from on high that tells you exactly which interests are top tier and which are second or third tier. You have to be prepared to have analytical debates and investigations of the question to reach any conclusion. But I think still establishing that kind of a framework and distinguishing top tier interests from secondary interests is essential for grand strategy.